Good morning. My name is Michelle Lavander, and I'm the director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar, Pulitzer Spotlight, Policing in the Era of Big Data. Today, we will hear from 2021 Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporters Kathleen McGrory and Neil Bedi. They will share how they unearthed a secretive policing operation in Florida for their powerful and impactful series, Targeted. Kathleen and Neil produced the series in collaboration with our center and its national fellowship. Their investigation found that the sheriff in Pasco County, Florida, uses data from a futuristic and controversial algorithm it devised to predict who will become a future criminal. Deputies harassed those who landed on its list, disrupting the lives of their families at all hours. The sheriff also used an algorithm and confidential school records obtained without parental permission to profile school children. In honoring them with the local reporting prize, Pulitzer judges praised the journalists for resourceful, creative reporting that exposed how a powerful and politically connected sheriff built a secretive intelligence operation. The Pasco sheriff isn't the only one to use such programs, which have raised civil rights and privacy concerns elsewhere. In the age of algorithms and informatics, law enforcement agencies across the country have turned to data-driven programs to help fight crime. The reporters will share tips for how journalists can go beyond press releases and find and analyze similar programs in their own communities in this webinar. A word about our distinguished speakers. Kathleen McGrory is the Deputy Investigations Editor at the Tampa Bay Times. In addition to Targeted, Kat and Neil collaborated on Heartbroken, a series on problems at Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital. That project was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting and won the 2019 George Polk Award for Local Reporting and an IRE Award. As a 2016 Center for Health Journalism National Fellow, Kat reported In Harm's Way, revealing that between 2010 and 2015, nearly 3,200 kids in Florida were killed or injured by firearms. She started her career at the Miami Herald, where she covered breaking news, education, and government. She's a graduate of Hamilton College and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. We'll also hear from Neil Bedi, a reporter at ProPublica in Washington, D.C., where he covers federal government agencies. He was previously an investigative reporter at the Tampa Bay Times, where he collaborated with Kat on Targeted, his 2020 National Fellowship Project with the Center for Health Journalism, and on Heartbroken. In addition, he has twice been named a finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists. He graduated from the UCLA School of Engineering. This webinar is made possible by the generous support of the California Endowment and individual supporters like you. You can tweet about this webinar at the hashtag police reporting. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for questions. Because we have many people participating in this webinar, we'll ask you to write your questions into the Q&A panel of Zoom. You can also write us there if you're experiencing technical problems. We'll be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org. And now let's turn to our two wonderful journalist panelists, Kathleen McGrory and Neil.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Give me just a moment to get my slides ready. Share my screen here. So today we're going to be talking about Targeted, which was the series that Neil and I did last year that we're examining an intelligence-led policing program in our community. The specific agency was the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, which Pasco County, for those of you who don't know, Florida is the county that is to the north of Tampa, to the north of St. Petersburg. It has some rural stretches to it. It has some suburban pockets. It is a predominantly white county. It is a middle-class county. And we spent the past year really digging into this intelligence effort there. So the format of our presentation will go a little something like this. We'll review the findings from our work. We will talk a little bit about the impact that the work has had over the past couple of months. From there, we'll kind of rewind a bit and talk a bit about how we found the story, what our reporting steps look like, and how we were ultimately able to get our findings here. And from there, we'll talk a little bit about how the agency responded to our findings and how they responded to our work more broadly, and how we handled that both in the text of the work and in the multimedia presentation and kind of the overall presentation. And after that, we'll zoom out. We'll talk about what we know about how these types of policing strategies are being applied in other police departments and sheriff's offices across the country, talk about some of the other controversies that have popped up around these different programs. And then we'll talk about some strategies that journalists in other places, members of this audience, can use to unearth some of the programs in their own jurisdictions, some of the questions you could potentially be asking, some of the records you could potentially be seeking. And we will open the floor to Q&A because we would love to just have a discussion at the end and field any questions that y'all might have. So without further ado, this is policing in the era of big data. So these are some of the people who we wrote about in our series, Targeted. I always think it's really powerful and impactful to see the faces of the people that we're going to be talking about and the folks that we spent a lot of time with and wrote about in the series. All right, so the key findings from our project. The first big picture thing that we were able to learn was that the sheriff's office was creating lists of people that it considers likely to break the law. And it was making these lists, using an algorithm that was taking into account many different data points. It's looking at whether or not people had broken the law in the past, their social networks, the people who they worked with, members of their families, friends, anybody to whom they had a connection. And then on top of that, kind of unspecified intelligence. So we were looking at the manual for this program, and it simply said that there was other data points that was going into this calculation, but the agency was not telling the broader public what those data points were. And in fact, there were also some arbitrary decisions going into who ultimately was landing on this list and who was not. So the consequences of landing on this list, of becoming one of this agency's targets, was that the agency would send deputies out to really monitor and harass the people who were considered targets, often without probable cause, a search warrant, or even any evidence of a crime. And what that monitoring and harassment would look like, we found a very similar pattern in how deputies were treating people who wound up on these lists. So deputies would show up at their homes repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single day. They might surround the target's home with police cars. They might knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning and wake everybody up in the house. They might shine flashlights into the home. It was also routine for deputies to either threaten the target or to actually go ahead and write them a code enforcement citation for having grass that was too long, or for having an errant trash bag, or having a vehicle that was not operational sitting in their driveway. And from what we were told from people who worked as part of this apparatus, former deputies, the mission was for these deputies to make these targets' lives so difficult and so miserable that they either felt moved to leave the county or to sue the agency for violating their rights. And our work found that, in the period of about 5 years, that the program had ensnared about 1,000 people. And at least 1 in 10 of those people were either 18 years old or younger. Some were 14, 15 years old. So in kind of trying to understand this intelligence program, we found kind of an adjacent intelligence program that the sheriff's office was using. It was a related program. It was separate, but it was related. They all kind of fell under the umbrella of what the agency calls intelligence-led policing. But what the sheriff's office was doing was actually creating a list of school children that it considered likely to become future criminals. And in order to make that determination, there was a different algorithm, and it was looking at factors such as their school grades and their school attendance records, their student discipline files, and on top of that, also mining information from the state child welfare system and looking at whether or not children had experienced adverse childhood experiences, so to speak, traumas, and factoring that into these decisions as well. The sheriff's office wasn't telling the kids' parents or their teachers when they were designated as kids who were likely to become future criminals. They weren't telling the kids themselves either. And in fact, the school superintendent, the first time we interviewed him, said he wasn't aware that his school district data was being used in this way. He obviously knew that the school district was giving the sheriff's office access to some of these data points, but he was unaware that they were being used to create this list of potential future criminals. And as of last October, there were 420 middle and high school students whose names appeared on this list.
So to give you all a bit of context, all of our reporting had to do with this intelligence-led policing program by the Pasco Sheriff's Office. It had actually been a program that was started back in 2011, shortly after the Pasco Sheriff took office. Chris Nocco, who is the Pasco Sheriff, took office and came up with this idea to really reform the whole department with this data-driven initiative. And for almost 10 years, no one really understood how that worked behind the scenes. The public didn't necessarily understand what was going on. And so that's part of the drive for us to look into it. Next slide. So we also did a deep dive after those findings into the man behind the machine. Pasco Sheriff Chris Nocco took office in 2011, but he quickly built a pretty long list of powerful, politically connected friends. You can see in these photos, he was close to Donald Trump when he came to visit Tampa. He was one of the few people who spoke with him, Marco Rubio, etc. The man was politically connected, and for a long time, no one really questioned him, which only brought more urgency for us to take a look, because as journalists, that's our job. Next slide. So after we published our stories, there was some pretty strong impact. Once this knowledge was given to the public, people responded. Pretty quickly, civil liberties groups denounced the programs. About 30 national and state groups came together and formed a coalition that is still doing work on the ground today to connect with communities and stand against the program. Additionally, 4 people who we had profiled in our story came together with a national public interest law firm to sue the sheriff's office because the program violated their constitutional rights. And Florida lawmakers proposed 2 bills during the last session to curb the policing tactics that we described in our series, both pieces of it. Oh, and probably the biggest piece of impact was that at the urging of a US congressman, the federal Department of Education actually opened an investigation into the use of data by the sheriff's office, the use of student data, which is normally very strongly protected by FERPA. And very recently, the sheriff's office and the school district announced that they were revising their rules for who could access some of that student data, and said that school resource officers, deputies who are put within schools would no longer have access to student grades.
So I'll back up a little bit and talk a bit about how we were able to identify the story and why we were drawn to pursue it. Neil and I had been reporting partners for a couple of years. We had worked on 2 projects together before this one of them having to do with the fatal accident at a power plant, and another having to do with mistakes that were made at a prestigious children's hospital that resulted in the unfortunate deaths and paralysis of some children. So we were looking for our next story. We were kind of interested in taking on a new topic, not focusing on healthcare again. And police accountability was something that we were both quite interested in. So we decided we were going to spend a little bit of time looking at some of our local law enforcement agencies and trying to look at some of the law enforcement agencies in our area that don't get a lot of coverage. Pasco County is in our readership area, but it's most of our readers live in Pinellas County, which is home to St. Petersburg, or Hillsborough County, which is home to Tampa. So those are the agencies we tend to cover a little bit more closely. But the Pasco Sheriff's Office is a very large agency with a big budget and a very powerful sheriff. And it felt like that would be a good place for us to focus our efforts. So very early on in the reporting process, one of the things we wanted to do was just kind of background the agency, learn about the sheriff, learn about the agency, try to wrap our head around some of the issues there. So we did what a lot of reporters do, and we went to the courthouse and started pulling some paper. We logged on to Pacer and started reading some of the federal suits that had been filed involving that agency. And one of the things that came across our radar was a 2019 federal lawsuit. So this lawsuit was massive. I believe it's 420 pages. This is the second amended complaint. And it is filed by, in the neighborhood of 24 former deputies against the sheriff and a number of high-ranking officials in the agency, claiming all sorts of corruption. It's actually a RICO case. The allegations really run the gamut here, and we spent some time reading the entire lawsuit. But there was one allegation that really stood out to us and caught our attention, and I've highlighted it here in yellow. And I had mentioned it just a few moments ago, but it was that one of the former deputies was alleging that a high-ranking official in the sheriff's office had ordered him in no uncertain terms to make citizens' lives miserable until they move or wanted to sue the agency. And if you'll continue reading this page, you'll see that the deputy was saying that he was making these contacts with citizens for the express purpose of harassing them, their families, and their associates, that they would show up all hours of the day and night, that they would use code enforcement to ticket them for anything they could find. And this idea was really intriguing to us. It was something that we wanted to check out and see if it was actually happening or not. So what did our reporting look like? One of the very first things we did when we set out to report on this story was to reach out to the sheriff and to agency leaders and to ask for an interview on this topic. I made a phone call I sent some follow-up emails and in no uncertain terms said we're really interested in learning more about this intelligence-led policing program. Would the sheriff be interested in sitting for an interview with us to help us learn more? The sheriff declined and the other top agency leaders declined through the spokesperson, but that was one of the very first things that we did. From there, we just wanted to learn as much as we could as possible. And we are lucky to live in Florida where we have very broad public records laws. So we started to make lots and lots of records requests. Over the year that we were reporting, we made dozens of records requests. We didn't do them all at once because we didn't want to totally flood the agency. But we asked for things like lists of targets, dispatch logs, so that we could see specifically where the deputies had gone, to whose homes they had gone, and on what grounds at what time. We asked for intelligence reports. The only reason that we knew that intelligence reports even existed was because we had gotten a copy of the manual that outlined how this program worked, and that pointed us to even know what some of the documents were to request. But intelligence reports, grant applications, the agency had sought federal dollars to help fund this, and there was a lot of information that lived in those grant applications. Body camera footage ended up being huge, and Neil will talk about that a little bit later. But it was one thing to hear people describe what their interactions had been like. Was another thing to read what those interactions had been like in the police reports, kind of coming from the perspective of the deputies. It was another thing entirely to actually watch the interactions on the body cam footage. So, those were things that we were looking for specific to this program. And then, of course, we requested a lot of things that you would ask if you were the beat reporter, right? Just basic things to know about the structure of the agency, things like employee rosters and agency budgets. There are lots of other records that we requested, and some of those we'll continue to mention as the presentation goes on. So we made our records request, or initial records request, in October of 2019, and the agency acknowledged our requests and didn't get back to us immediately. In fact, it took us until the end of January to get the records that we were really interested in, to get some of the records that we were really interested in. And it took us getting our lawyers involved to kind of help shake the trees a bit. Initially, they kind of ignored us for a bit. After that, they said that some of the records that we wanted were not going to be available to us because they had active criminal intelligence, which is a statutory exemption here in Florida. At one point, we had requested some emails, a single year worth of emails that were, specific emailed reports on intelligence. And the quote we got back was $334,000, $334,063 for a year's worth of emails. Obviously, that was not within our budget, so we had to tinker with that request a little bit and go back and forth a couple of rounds. But we were really, there were a couple of months where we didn't have the records that we needed. But we did find something online that really gave us a head start on the reporting and enabled us to start to collect information before those records came in. And what that was actually a citizen journalist for a while had noticed that the Pasco County Sheriff's Office was actually publishing its dispatch log in real time online. And the citizen journalist had been just scraping that, taking snapshots of that, and building a searchable database of all of the calls for service and just dispatch calls that the sheriff's office had for a few years. So we used that online resource as a starting point because it told us when deputies were going out and visiting people under the auspices of what they called prolific offender checks. That was checking on people who were targets, people who had been kind of caught up in this algorithm. And we made a list of the places that the deputies had gone to the most. And we just got in the car and hit the road and started knocking on dozens of doors and just asking people what their interactions had been like with the deputies. And very early on, folks in all corners of the county were describing a very similar pattern of reporting that the deputies had showed up at their house for no apparent reason. You know, it wasn't like they were there with a search warrant or they were there with probable cause to arrest somebody, but just to check on them. And in making those checks, they were writing code enforcement citations. They were coming with just in a very aggressive manner. You know, sometimes very late at night or early in the morning, people said that they felt embarrassed, they felt harassed, and they just felt like there was nobody that they could turn to complain about these very aggressive tactics. So as we started to hear more and more people telling us the same thing, you know, we started to realize that, yeah, there was definitely a story here for us to dig into.
Yeah, and then as we started digging and started getting records back, we started being able to do more things with that data and information. Very quickly early on, I was excited to figure out how I could reverse engineer this algorithm, this formula that the sheriff's office was using to identify who was most likely to commit crimes in the future. I have a background in computer science, and I'm always looking for ways to use that to enhance our investigative reporting. And in this case, we had early on access to the manual for this program. And within that manual, there was a page that described the formula for how they scored every person in the county based on their arrest histories, based on whether they had been suspected of a crime, whether they had been victim to a crime, all sorts of different data to give each of these people a score. And I quickly started building some code to copy that manual and see if I fed it the same data, who would pop out. And this was all to just better understand how this worked behind the scenes. When we're doing a long-term investigative report like this, we just want as much information as possible. And this was a huge piece of it. We knew that our reverse engineering was going to miss some pieces of data that we could not have. Things like whether people were suspected of a crime isn't public record or isn't even in a database somewhere that we could easily pull. So we used the data we could get to make as close of an approximation as we could. And we didn't use it for any investigative findings or anything like that, but it helped sharpen our traditional reporting. It helped us see who was most often targeted, see who got the highest scores, and start visiting those places as well and compare those pieces of data. And as part of that deeper reporting, we started first looking for agency insiders who could continue to tell us about how the program worked behind the scenes, how it evolved over time. This is a program that was around for almost 10 years and had changed over that time. And we wanted to hear from people on the inside how it worked. So we quickly started looking for people like that who would talk to us. We reached out to anyone who would speak to us. And so we had a whole spreadsheet of people we reached out to. We spent a lot of time with the individuals and families who were willing to let us in their homes and really talk to us about their experience. We visited them often and then went back into their cases and requested as many records, body cam footage, data as possible to get their cases and stories from as many perspectives as possible. We even, as we started getting hours and hours of body cam footage and started reviewing these cases over and over, we realized that the body cam footage itself held its own story, and we built an interactive story that helped readers actually understand what this harassment looked like for the people being harassed. I think it's one thing to say in words that people were being harassed and they were being visited over and over, but when you see it in video, you really start to understand that this was not okay.
Apologies, I keep advancing the slide on poor Neil. So we'll talk a little bit about how the agency responded to our work. So as I mentioned, we had reached out and asked for an interview in October of 2019, long time ago, and asked for an interview on this very specific topic. And in that initial request, we did say we were interested in it because we had seen that it was in the lawsuit. So I didn't get the sense that they thought we were going to write a puff piece on it or anything. They didn't want to talk to the investigative team about this program. And obviously the agency knew that we were continuing to work on it because we were pulling a lot of documents and touching base with a lot of former deputies. I mean, it wasn't a secret that we were working on this. But when we had come up with our findings, when we had a pretty substantial list of things that we wanted to bring back and specifically get their statements on, at that point we asked for a second interview, and the sheriff declined that interview, as well as did the other top people in this intelligence-led policing department. For us, it is very important that we not surprise anybody with anything that we are going to publish in the newsroom. So when they declined our request for an interview, and actually even after they declined it, I asked again, stressing how important I thought it was for them to sit down with us and talk with us and have their perspective represented in the story. Then they declined again. So after that happened, then we put together a memo that said, okay, here are all of our findings. We don't want you to be surprised by them. If you'd like to respond to any of these things, please let us know. And by the way, we'd still love to do an interview with you. We always stress that we would still love to do an interview. So the agency ultimately ended up sending us a number of statements. Just for this first story alone, that spanned more than 30 pages. Pretty much what they said was that they really stand behind this program. They really liked the way this program had worked. They thought that it had been very effective. They pointed out that, hey, burglaries, larcenies, and auto thefts had really declined in their jurisdiction since they started using this program. So they said that they stood behind it fully. And they essentially accused us of cherry picking examples. And they said that what we were painting as harassment, they said that was actually very basic law enforcement functions. So what did we do with this? Well, we included some of it in the text of our story. We published the full statements online. And then, in addition to just taking a PDF of their 30-page statement and sticking it at the bottom of the story and saying, if you'd like to read the full statement, click here, we also took what they had said and essentially organized it by topic so that it would be easier for readers to kind of parse through and understand and make sense of. In some cases, that involved us fact checking when we had to. So to a couple different points, I mean, the one that I just mentioned, for example, that the agency said that that they believed that this program had led to a significant decline in burglaries, larcenies, and auto thefts. I mean, one of the things we thought was important was to tell readers that, yeah, that decline was real, but that decline actually mirrored the decline in other surrounding counties that weren't using these types of strategies. and that it might have had more to do with just the overall crime trends in Florida than this specific approach to policing. And we pointed out that violent crime had actually gone up in this jurisdiction. And there were other factual issues with some of the statements that the sheriff's office had sent us, and when there were issues that we had to correct, we went ahead and corrected them. But for us here, transparency was just key and of utmost importance. We wanted to make sure that readers had a chance to see and digest exactly how the sheriff's office had responded to our investigation. And I think taking that extra step to make the words readable as far as the presentation goes, rather than just including that PDF that was kind of dense and difficult to read, but actually taking the words and putting them on a page and organizing them by topic was really helpful, and really served us in the interest of transparency. So I'll zoom out for a quick second, and we're kind of nearing the end of our presentation here. We'll go back to kind of where we started, this concept of intelligence-led policing. What we were able to write about and unearth here in Pasco County was actually pretty specific to Pasco County. So this concept of intelligence-led policing is really, it's an umbrella term. It's kind of ambiguous. Different agencies interpret it in different ways. What Pasco County considers to be intelligence-led policing is different from what another agency might be considering or calling intelligence-led policing. And there may be totally different strategies involved with each approach. So it's very difficult to say exactly what is happening in each different agency across the country, because there are so many, and also because it's something that's constantly changing. And it's also, again, this concept is pretty ambiguous, and it's just being deployed in different ways by different agencies. But what we do know is that a lot of agencies across the country use some facets of this intelligence-led approach. And another thing that we know is that when these strategies and these programs have come to light, when somebody shined a light on them, when the public has become aware of them, they have been hugely controversial. In LA a few years ago, it became public that the LAPD was using similar strategies to try to identify people who might become future criminals or who might break the law in the future based on their previous arrest records and the people with whom they associate, and was again kind of an algorithmic approach to targeting people. That caused a tremendous amount of controversy. There were activists who came out against it, spoke against it, and ultimately the LAPD decided to shut down that aspect of its program and really reevaluate it. We saw something very similar happen in Chicago a year or two ago with what they called the heat list. So these programs exist, and they exist in your jurisdiction. So it may not look exactly like what we reported on in Pasco, but there's a lot to look for.
Sorry, I was answering a Q&A question. So when you're looking at this in your area, we had a few tips that we wanted to share. So first, figure out how your local law enforcement agencies are using data and algorithms to drive decisions. And it doesn't have to be a new fancy program. I mean, this program that we looked into was almost 10 years old. It's just that no one really looked behind the curtain to figure out what was going on. So figure out how your law enforcement agencies are using data, interesting ways they're using data. There are all sorts of different ways they could be, and they don't all look the same, but each one of them is worth a stronger look into how they work. If you find some programs that look interesting, start requesting manuals that explain how they work, internal documents that explain how deputies are taught to work with these programs. Start figuring out what this looks like behind the scenes, not what is released in press statements every now and then. You should also be requesting contracts with software companies that do this kind of work. You don't know if your local law enforcement agency is working with companies like Palantir or Predpol to do some of this work. And if you can get the contracts, you can get a way into this information. In Pasco County's case, they weren't doing work with those type of companies, but it's still worth looking into. You can also investigate other uses of AI or data in policing. There's all sorts of different topics that people are starting to get into. There was some great reporting out of LA recently about Ring cameras, drones, all sorts of things. So keep an eye out for anything that looks interesting, anything that looks cutting edge and high tech, and figure out how it's being used and how your law enforcement agencies are ensuring that people's civil rights are still being protected. And throughout all of that, be transparent and fair. I know Kath has said this multiple times, but I will repeat it. Be transparent with your readers, be transparent with the people you're reporting on. If it's a law enforcement agency, be upfront with what you're reporting, and always be absolutely fair, because when these stories have pretty huge findings, there's no point in undermining that by not being fair from the get-go.
Well said, Neil. Well said. And that's the end of our presentation. So we're happy to take the questions and continue the conversation.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And folks, you can put your questions in the Q&A field. Because we have a lot of people on this webinar, we won't be able to call on you individually. Neil and Kat have also been answering a few of the questions that are already there in the chat. So we have a couple of new ones coming in. James Causey asks, did you talk to residents or homeowners about the program? Did they have any complaints?
Yeah, many of the people we were interviewing were residents, and they were homeowners in Pasco. And they were largely people who had been targeted, but yes, they had lots of complaints and brought up concerns about the program violating people's civil liberties and kind of just not being the type of policing that they were used to or wanting. Folks seem to be more interested in a community-based policing approach than something like this.
We have a question from Karen Buffard. You requested public records on some things that I'm surprised you're able to get. How did you figure out what you could access under Florida's FOIA laws?
Good question. So some of it was stuff that we kind of assumed we could get. I mean, this roster of people who were targeted by this program, the program itself in its manual describes that these people aren't being investigated for an active crime necessarily, and they're using past data and information. So it felt like that was free game. Emails, internal presentations. We went in with the approach that we had a right to some of this and let the agency knock some of that down themselves. But that's typically how we handle these things. We go in with an approach that the public deserves a lot of this information. And if you want to say no, please explain why.
Yeah, exactly. And on some of the records that we got, there was some information that was redacted. And the agency said it was because it had to do with active criminal intelligence. And when agencies cite that exemption, it's a really hard one for us to fight because they have the upper hand as far as determining, what investigations are ongoing. That's typically just not information we have access to. But in many of the cases here, we assumed that not everything was going to be active criminal intelligence, specifically in cases where they were saying that they were, findings based on people's past records, which are public, or, other factors that we believe to be public. And as Neil said, we let them, give us the statutory exemption. There were instances where we did push back when they gave us that exemption or other exemptions. And then there were instances where that exemption felt totally reasonable, and we moved on to the next request.
And Jana Nagarajan Bhutani says, are there any existing federal laws regarding the use of data and its conflicts with individual privacy? Is it far-reaching enough to deal with the pace at which technology has progressed in this area?
I don't know a heck of a lot about federal law as it relates to this specific area, so I don't know that there's much that I can say on that. Neil, have you looked at that at all?
I don't have much to add. I just haven't figured that out, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's an interesting avenue of inquiry, though, for sure.
Are a lot of these regulatory parameters local or state, and is there anything on the books?
So there were those two bills that were written in response to our reporting locally in the Florida legislature. Kat, I don't think they ended up getting passed. I don't remember, but
They did not end up getting passed. One of the pieces of this that was really interesting to us was the politics piece of it. So when we published the series with our findings, one of the first things that we did afterwards was we pinged all of the local elected officials in Pasco County to get their take on it. Is this a program that they liked? Is this a program that they supported? Did they have any issues with it? And we could get very few people to call us back. And when they did, they would say, oh, well, I haven't read the series, but I trust the sheriff. He's a wonderful sheriff. And when we continued to peel back the layers of the onion, we learned that the sheriff was incredibly powerful and politically connected, and at the state level, quite close to both the Speaker of the Florida House and the President of the Florida Senate. So we did see some lawmakers file state bills this year to try to get some change, but they didn't go very far.
Karen Brown asks, can you talk about the interviews with the people who were targeted? Who was willing to talk? Who wasn't? And were they concerned that talking to the press would get them harassed even more?
That's a really good question, Karen. Thank you. It's funny. I remember distinctly when we went to knock on the door of Tammy Howman, who was one of the people that we profiled in our story. And her children were all sitting outside the house, and Neil and I parked, and we kind of walked up to the door, with our press badges on. But we went to ask the kids if their mom was home, and I think they would agree with this characterization. They were pretty abrasive. They were like, "Who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want?" And we explained that we were reporters and we were looking at this program, and it was our understanding that they might have had interactions with deputies, so on and so forth. And as soon as we told them what we were doing, they were like, oh my gosh, yes, let me get my mom. Yes, hold on. And they ultimately apologized for their demeanor, but they were like, you don't understand what this has been like. We have cops at our house every day. We're incredibly defensive. We're afraid of people showing up. So, sometimes when we could kind of get past that initial reluctance to speak to anybody, folks were really willing to talk with us and to share their stories. And I think they did fear retaliation, and they did on some level fear that talking to us and being in the newspaper could make their situation worse. But I think many people also thought that there was really nobody else to go to. Some of the families had reached out to lawyers. Lawyers weren't interested in taking the case because the sheriff is so powerful. They just didn't feel like they had anybody else to complain to, and this was kind of their last hope, if you will.
Yeah, and we really tried to visit as many homes as possible, and we drove hundreds, thousands of miles because Pasco County is huge. We knocked on so many doors. There were plenty of people who didn't want to talk for different reasons, but we were willing to talk to anyone who was willing to speak. We were willing to leave our card for anyone who could talk to us. We wrote notes for people who could get back to us if they weren't home. So it was a long process, but we needed to talk to people.
Yeah, it took us many months, and in fact, we were lucky that we had started the door knocking when we did in October, November of 2019, because by March of 2020, door knocking was no longer a thing that we could do.
And Jorge Carrasco asks, I would like to know a bit about the writing process of the investigation. How much time did it take, and was it written by only one of you both? How did you handle that process?
Yeah, so me and Kat have been reporting partners for a while, so we know how to work together pretty well. I think in the first stages of that first story, we would outline the story, the draft together, and then split up the sections and write them separately. But I've always acknowledged that Kat is a much better writer than me, and when it was time to like really get into the writing and switch off, I let Kat zone in on that, and I would go figure out some reporting holes and close those things. But we've gotten really good at making the most of our time and working together when that's the best use of our time, and then splitting up and covering as much as possible when that's the best use.
Neil is a very generous reporting partner. Neil is a very talented writer, in addition to being a talented reporter and data journalist and photographer and coder and a number of other things. But yeah, we would outline together. We would split up different sections, and our process is to go through a number of drafts. And in doing so, everybody has a chance to put their fingers on the keys and to kind of mold different sections of the story. So by the end, it feels like something we did in total collaboration, to be honest.
Thank you. We have a question from Kylan Jackson. What are some workarounds to getting related data which doesn't involve lawyers?
Good question. I mean, some of the data we got didn't necessarily need lawyers. We definitely brought them in to get that data faster and to get our hands on it faster. But I mean, it was all through public records requests. It was all through asking over and over again for this data. There are also usually, I mean, depending on the topic you're writing about, there are usually public sources of data as well. And so it's a matter of figuring out what's available and what you can use. And then there's always the option of building your own data. If you can get access to records, you can always take those records and build a spreadsheet to turn it into data that you can then analyze.
You can also take a look at what agencies are sending up to regulatory agencies as well. Sometimes you can find data as exhibits in lawsuits. I mean, data pops up in unlikely places. We were very lucky that the citizen journalists had been scraping some of the data that the agency used to publish, online in real time, and then had just posted that. So you can definitely find data outside of having to get your lawyers involved.
And I'll just make a plug here for investigative reporters and editors, because they have a lot of tip sheets about FOIAs and public record requests. And there's often something called the First Amendment type coalition, and maybe even some funding for free legal aid, depending on your state. So those are some other resources to look for. We have a question from Christina Carone. Early on, how did you manage to get a copy of the Intelligence-led Policing Manual?
That was online, and it was also an exhibit in that early lawsuit we talked about finding. But an early version of the manual, I think it was 2016, 2015, that was online. I think the Florida Sheriff's Association had posted it online, so we were able to find it. It was partly online because the sheriff's office was often touting the program and saying it was doing really good work with data. And so they were actively bragging about it, so we were able to find it.
And that was a hugely important jumping off point, because in being able to read that manual, it referenced all these different reports and other records that, had we not had that manual, we wouldn't know the names of them. We wouldn't know that that paper existed, and we wouldn't have known to request it.
We then requested any future and past versions of the manual as well to make sure we understood how the program changed over time. And there was one newer version in 2018, I want to say, that had slight adjustments, new information, but the first manual is definitely the jumping off point.
Probably worth mentioning that the second manual that they sent us, the updated version they initially sent us, with large parts of it redacted. And we pushed back on that and were, able to get an unredacted copy of it.
Nina Shapiro says, I'm interested that you contacted the Sheriff's Department right away. Often we wait until we do a lot of research and have findings before asking for an interview and getting a response. What are your thoughts on that?
I can feel that one. Yeah, I mean, I think in investigative reporting, there are all different strategies. I'll speak on behalf of Neil and myself, we tend to like to reach out to the subjects early on in the process. I would certainly say we had done some reporting and some research around it, so we didn't reach out totally blind. But we really were interested in trying to get their take as early as possible. I really do think that that kind of information on the front end can really help guide your reporting. There are some instances where we as reporters may be trying to jump into a story and there's no there. So having that conversation on the front end can help you to avoid falling into that pitfall. They declined, and in this case, we just kind of continued on with our reporting. We weren't deterred by that. Certainly there are some other instances where you may choose to wait a little bit longer until you go and approach the subject of an investigation. But in this case, we really thought it made sense to go to them as early as possible. And it just felt like the fairest thing to do.
So our last question, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of them, is from Frank, who says, I work in Chicago and covered the heat list. The Pasco program was a Frankenstein version of Chicago. What I found earlier this year is that even though Chicago's police program was disbanded, the same algorithmic analysis is now being used to guide nonprofit anti-violence groups to reach out to people. Wonder if that's happening in Florida.
Yeah, it very well could be. We're seeing these algorithms being deployed in a number of different arenas. And I think the thing that is kind of interesting is who is deploying them and to what ends, right? I mean, when you've got a police agency that's using an algorithm to try to figure out who's going to break the law in the future and really direct intensive and aggressive policing towards those people, it certainly raises all types of civil rights questions, right? I think that you're definitely seeing social service providers try to harness the power of big data to be more targeted in their approach to providing services as well. I think to a lot of the experts that I have spoken to, that seems a little bit more benign, and like there are potentially fewer ways for that to go off the rails. But still, it does really raise some interesting questions around privacy, around rights. So again, really interesting line of inquiry, and something I am sure is happening in Florida and worth journalists here and elsewhere looking at.
Well, I want to thank these two talented reporters for their incredible reporting and for sharing the story behind it with all of us today. We're so appreciative. We will be sending all of you a short survey. Please fill it out, telling us your feedback on this presentation and what you would most value from our Health Matters webinar series going forward. We'll also be archiving this webinar in a couple of hours. And I also just wanted to mention that we really count on supporters, individual supporters who find value in this work like you. And so should you want to support our ongoing Health Matters webinar series, here's some of the instructions. I want to wish everybody good health and have a great day.